I had selected a topic for interaction with you, which is more relevant to ordinary members of the public, which we are. All of us are primarily members of the public first, and then be an industrialist or members of FAPCCI and all. So the idea that impacts them, that's one I thought I should give some explanation about why we did certain things from the Reserve Bank of India, the rationale behind it, and the difficulties that the common persons faced and how we are addressing them. So then after finishing that, I will certainly react to certain ideas that have been proposed both by Mr. Ayadevara and Mr. Prasad. I'll be interacting with them. First is about the know your customer. Is it a recent phenomenon? Because this know your customer as a concept we have been talking about in the last few years only. But is it really a recent phenomenon? No, not at all. This is a concept the banking system had been practicing, not with that name as such, but the essence of the know your customer concept has been practiced by the bankers right from day one when the bank itself started way back in 15th or 16th century itself. KYC was always there in banking. The focus earlier was more on the asset side and not on the liability side, as no banker could risk parting with his funds to an unknown person. So when a banker lends money to any party, whether it's an industrialist or a trade or business or even individual, unless he knows how far the money can come back to me, so that credit risk assessment, it's nothing but a know your customer assessment. The thorough appraisal process to screen the potential borrowers is a good example of a KYC process. Then issues such as illegal and or black money and more recently terrorism financing became matters of serious concern, and then KYC on payment side and remittances and consequently on the liability side started assuming greater importance. Sound KYC policies and procedures are critical for protecting the safety and soundness of banks and the integrity of the banking system in the country. Due to increasing globalization of Indian banks, their interaction with other countries' financial systems are expanding, making the task of ensuring safety of our systems more critical. International obligations and the interregulatory consensus built via United Nations resolutions, Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and the Financial Action Task Force also require that we put in place an elaborate KYC framework in India. The Financial Action Task Force is an intergovernmental body established in the year 1989 as a G7 initiative. Its tasks are to set the standards and promote effective implementation of legal, regulatory, and operational measures for combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. It is a policy-making body which works to generate the necessary political will to bring about national legislative and regulatory changes and reforms in these areas. It monitors the progress of its members in implementing necessary measures. There are 36 full-fledged members of the FATF. India is one of them. Over 18 jurisdictions around the world have committed to the FATF recommendations. India has also committed to implement the recommendations of FATF. Originally, in 1990, FATF had 40 recommendations focusing on drug money. It revised its recommendations in 1996 and broadened the scope. In 2001, it further added 8 special recommendations, later on added one more to combat financing of terrorism, which were further revised in 2003. The latest exercise in 2012 combined these 40 plus 9 into 40. Basel Committee. Findings of an internal survey of the cross-border banking in 1999 by the Basel Committee identified deficiencies in KYC policies for banks in a large number of countries. It constituted a working group on cross-border banking to examine the then KYC procedures and to draw standards applicable to banks in all countries. It issued a consultative document called the Customer Due Diligence for Banks in January 2001. While the FATF's focus is on money laundering and terrorist financing, The Basel Committee's approach on KYC is from the wider prudential and risk management perspective and not just anti-money laundering related perspective. The Reserve Bank has prescribed that KYC policy of the banks should have the following key elements: customer acceptance policy, customer identification procedures, monitoring of transactions, and risk management. Customer acceptance policy. The salient features of this policy are like this. No anonymous or fictitious binomial accounts should be allowed. Banks are not to open or close accounts when unable to apply appropriate customer due diligence. Even for closing accounts, the bankers will have to apply due diligence. They should define parameters of risk perception to enable categorization of the customers. Documentation or information requirements for different risk categories have also been prescribed. Banks are required to prepare a profile of each customer. The circumstances where a customer is permitted to act on behalf of another person or entity should be spelled out. Identity of the customer does not match with those of criminal backgrounds, banned entities, terrorists, etc. The identification procedures include identifying the customer and verifying his or her identity by using reliable, independent source documents, data, or information. The banks must be able to certify the competent authorities that due diligence was observed based on the risk profile of the customer in compliance with the extant guidelines in place. Such risk-based approach is considered necessary to avoid disproportionate costs to banks and a burdensome regime for the customers. The nature of information documents required would also depend on the type of the customer, whether he is an individual, a corporate, a society, or like that. And we had prescribed for each type of customer different things, like the customer identification procedure. When a customer is required, while establishing a banking relationship, a customer ID is required. While carrying out a financial transaction, as in the case of walk-in customer, that time also customer ID is required.